Julian Marlowe was not a man easily forgotten. By the time he disappeared from London's financial circles, his name had already become a whispered legend, the prodigy who dismantled hedge funds with the same ease others folded napkins. But it wasn't his brilliance that made people lower their voices when speaking about him. It was the scandal, the betrayal, the fall, and the revenge that came years later like a sharpened blade. Julian was born with nothing, the son of a cleaner and a warehouse guard in East Ham. But by 29, he had already bought his first building in Mayfair and appeared twice on the cover of The Economist under the headline, "The Numbers Whisperer." He wasn't flashy, no gold watches or Lamborghini roars outside nightclubs. He was quiet, calculating, always listening more than speaking. But Julian made a mistake. He trusted the wrong man. Gregory Sloan was charming, connected, and ruthless. The owner of Helix Capital, one of the largest private equity firms in Europe, Sloan saw potential in Julian, invited him into his empire like a father would welcome a long-lost son. And for 5 years, Julian built fortunes for Helix, maneuvering through economic storms, regulatory traps, and global shocks like a chess grandmaster 2 moves ahead. Until the numbers didn't add up. One Friday morning, Julian discovered a discrepancy in the ledgers, just a few £1,000,000 off. But like a thread in an expensive suit, once pulled, the whole garment unraveled. He found offshore accounts, shell companies, and fake losses. Billions were being siphoned off from Helix's investors, pension funds, charitable trusts, even universities. At the center of it all, Gregory Sloan. Julian did what he believed was right. He compiled the evidence. He went to the authorities. But justice, in high finance, is rarely clean. 2 weeks later, before any charges could be filed, the story broke. Julian Marlowe accused in £1 billion embezzlement. Headlines screamed betrayal. The police raided his home. Helix cut him off, painted him as the rogue element, and Sloan masterfully shed crocodile tears on camera, claiming he was devastated by his protege's betrayal. Julian had been framed. He lost everything: his reputation, his wealth, his freedom. A short trial, a long sentence, 8 years in Belmarsh, where financial genius was worthless against gangs and broken men. Julian stayed quiet, watched, learned, and remembered. He remembered every face who turned against him, every lie, every false testimony, every smirk from Sloan on the witness stand. And when he got out, he disappeared. But not really. Julian had always known that the world of high finance was built on shifting sands. But what he hadn't anticipated was how quickly those sands could become a desert, vast, silent, and deadly. The morning after the Geneva broadcast, Julian woke up to 37 missed calls. From journalists, from old friends, from lawyers he hadn't spoken to in years. The media had gone into a frenzy. "The whistleblower tycoon," screamed the Financial Times. "Marlowe, the man who turned on the system," echoed Bloomberg. His face was plastered across news sites and television stations, some hailing him as a hero, others branding him a traitor. By noon, the SEC officially launched a multi-country investigation into the Ironside Holdings empire. Raids were conducted across Switzerland, Luxembourg, Singapore, and New York. Billions in assets were frozen. But Julian knew the storm was only beginning. In boardrooms across the world, powerful men and women met in hushed rooms, away from public eyes. These weren't CEOs or bankers. They were the shadow network behind the curtain families and syndicates that had shaped the modern economic order for a century. And Julian had just lit a match in their archives. He had exposed not just corruption, but lineage-level secrets ties between multinational banks and organized crime, collusion between governments and illegal mineral smuggling, and most damning of all, the false flag humanitarian funds that funneled millions into private defense contractors for silent wars. Julian had made enemies, not of companies, but of legacies. That night, while staying at a secured safe house near Lake Como, his encrypted laptop pinged. Subject: "You forgot one thing." From shadowmatter@protonmail.com. Message: "You think you're done? You barely cracked the lid. Check Project Nereus. Start with the South Atlantic cables. You'll know what to do." Julian's heart dropped. He hadn't heard that code name in over a decade. Project Nereus was a myth, rumors of deep-sea data routing systems that avoided all surveillance protocols, black market digital pipelines beneath the Atlantic, built during the late 92nd, supposedly untraceable. But he remembered something. Back when he worked under Ironside's Infrastructure Development Division, he'd overseen part of a classified build off the coast of Namibia. It was a routine data cable expansion, or so he thought. Now he understood. They weren't transferring data. They were transferring currency. Not digital money, not crypto, but something older. Julian flew under a false identity to São Vicente, a small island in Cape Verde. From there, he hired a local sailor to take him 3 hours offshore to coordinates embedded in that single phrase: start with the South Atlantic cables. Beneath the waves, 300 meters down, lay a forgotten repeater station. Julian dove with a rented sub, illegally modified with an industrial-grade cable claw. The repeater wasn't just a signal amplifier, it housed a secret storage node. Inside it, a rusted briefcase, sealed in polymer. And within that, a notebook, not digital, handwritten, leather-bound, old. It was titled, The Grigori Ledger, Volume 3. Julian opened the first page. He who controls currency controls compliance. But he who controls myth controls memory. What followed were hundreds of pages documenting secret agreements spanning decades, shadow trades involving gold, rare minerals, narcotics, even art. But most disturbingly, documented references to black-budget experiments involving human longevity. People bought, sold, preserved. One entry made his blood run cold. Subject Alpha 7, transferred from Belgrade to Reykjavik facility, 2003. Purpose: cognitive simulation under synthetic immortal construct. Contract signed by Marlowe, Ironside. Status: suspended. Awakening scheduled 2035. Julian dropped the notebook. Alpha 7 wasn't a number, it was a code name. One he had signed off on during an experimental investment into a biotech firm in Serbia. He had been told it was a theoretical AI simulation funding model. They had lied. Julian raced to Iceland under the cover of a fake diplomatic mission. Using the last of his contacts in the Nordic intelligence circle, he breached a remote facility listed only as Glacier 13. It had been decommissioned since 2012, or so they claimed. Deep inside, in a cryogenic vault, lay 10 capsules. One was missing. One was active. One was labeled Alpha 7 Marlowe Directive. Julian stood frozen. The capsule's biometric panel glowed blue. It had recognized him. He was still listed as primary authorization. He placed his hand on the screen. The chamber hissed open. Inside was a man, or what remained of one. Eyes opened, not glassy, not robotic, alive. Julian? The figure croaked. Julian fell backward. It was his brother. Presumed dead at age 21 inch, a skiing accident in Austria. But Julian always suspected something was off. The body had been cremated too quickly. There had been no autopsy, no investigation. His brother had been taken, preserved, for 2 decades. Julian now knew the full depth of Ironside's power, not just financial manipulation, but human experimentation, cognitive theft, and simulated immortality. They didn't just preserve wealth. They preserved people, the ones who knew too much, or were worth too much to let die. Julian smuggled his brother out using a medical transport cover. But he knew he couldn't run forever. The next move had to be public, global. So he reached out to the last person he thought he'd ever trust. Alexia Voss, ex-CIA analyst, now investigative documentarian. The one person who had almost exposed Ironside 10 years ago, before being ruined by a planted scandal. He found her living off-grid in Patagonia, editing travel films for a local news station. When she saw him, she didn't scream, she didn't cry. She simply said, "Took you long enough." Together, they began building the archive, a decentralized broadcast system that couldn't be stopped. No server farms, no central node, just encrypted fragments uploaded across millions of phones, satellites, and home assistants worldwide. A virus of truth. When it was ready, Julian uploaded the full Grigori ledger, along with the footage of his brother, the cryogenic vaults, the ledger translations, and real-time financial links back to major governments. The world changed in 72 hours. Stock markets crashed, arrests were made, assassinations followed, but most of all, belief shifted. People started asking questions about longevity, about legacy, about power. And Julian? He disappeared again. Some say he lives in the Arctic, continuing his broadcasts from under the ice. Others believe he died in the riots that followed the financial collapse of 2027. But somewhere, in a quiet frequency on the shortwave dial, a voice can be heard. They buried the truth in vaults of ice and gold. But memory melts. But something had changed in Julian. The fire that once burned for vengeance had dimmed slightly, replaced now by a sharper flame, one that sought not only retribution but justice, not just for himself, but for every life that had been devoured by the Marlowe machine. Julian returned to London, not to his old home that had been auctioned off years ago, but to a modest flat under a new identity. Jonathan Cole, the name read on his bank cards, driver's license, and diplomatic cover. His voice was now softer, bearing a hint of Mediterranean inflection, and his eyes no longer carried the trembling fury of a boy betrayed, but the calm calculation of a man with a plan. Through offshore accounts and legitimate foreign ventures, Julian had acquired substantial silent stakes in small but influential firms, legal consultancies, AI compliance services, even data recovery startups. He was building a quiet empire, one node at a time. And then came phase 2. He began feeding documents, real, damning, undeniable documents, to a seasoned journalist named Elise Tavener, a war reporter turned investigative bulldog. She didn't know Julian's true identity, only that her mysterious source went by the codename Ferryman, and that his leaks had already brought down 2 mid-level hedge fund managers and triggered an internal audit at one of the city's most discreet wealth banks. Each document she received led to something bigger: tax fraud, insider trading, falsified ESG reports, bribery of foreign officials. And at the center of all these operations, hidden behind layers of shell companies and nominee directors, was the unmistakable imprint of Everlock Capital. Julian knew Elise wouldn't stop digging. He fed her breadcrumbs with surgical precision, guiding her to the rot he had spent a decade uncovering. With every headline she broke, the media's attention sharpened, the regulatory noose tightened, but none of it could prepare the world for what came next. It was the autumn of the following year, when the first of the Marlowe trust accounts were publicly exposed. Through an anonymous whistleblower case, orchestrated by Julian under yet another alias record surfaced, showing that Julian's own trust fund had been drained years ago to finance the back-channeling of foreign money into UK real estate, weapons manufacturing, and offshore political bribes. These funds were redirected through a labyrinth of banking relationships and had directly benefited none other than his uncle, Douglas Marlowe, and the firm's longtime fixer, Nigel Beaton. The press erupted. Overnight, Elise Tavener became a media icon. Politicians demanded answers. Shareholders fled Everlock in droves. And inside the halls of the firm that had once crushed his life without hesitation, a silent panic set in. But Julian wasn't done yet. He had one final card to play the Marlowe ledger. It had taken him 6 years to decrypt, verify, and recompile. The ledger was a digital reconstruction of Everlock's black books transactions not meant to exist. Arms deals masked as real estate projects, bribes funneled through consulting fees, falsified insurance claims, and encrypted communications with foreign intelligence operatives. Julian knew releasing it would have global consequences. Heads of state might fall. Millions could be lost overnight. Entire economies destabilized. He waited. He watched. And on the 5th anniversary of his father's suicide, Julian uploaded the entire ledger to a decentralized peer-to-peer platform with thousands of seeded nodes across the world. The file was untraceable, irreversible, a Pandora's box with no return key. Within 24 hours, the international markets reeled. Arrest warrants were issued across 3 continents. Interpol flagged Douglas Marlowe as a person of interest. He vanished within days, rumored to have fled to the Balkans. Nigel Beaton was not so lucky. Cornered in Zurich, he was detained and extradited to the UK. Under immense pressure, he turned Crown witness. His testimonies implicated over a dozen senior officials in 5 countries. And yet, even as the world burned from the revelations, Julian remained invisible, not a name on any indictment, not a whisper in the press. To the public, Ferryman remained a myth, a ghost, a whisper behind the fall of a dynasty. In truth, he was sipping coffee in a quiet villa overlooking the cliffs of Cinque Terre, watching waves crash against the rocks. He had done what no court, no regulator, no journalist had been able to do: bring down the empire that had once destroyed him. But justice, as Julian knew all too well, is never truly clean. There were casualties, collateral, broken innocence caught in the unraveling. And so he sat alone with his thoughts, burdened not just by what he had done, but by what he had become.